Good evening, everyone. My name is Katerina Gregos, and I'm the curator of the exhibition Modern Love, or Love in the Age of Cold Intimacies, and co-curator with Arjan Dunevind of IMPAKT Festival 2021. Welcome. It's very nice to have a live audience. And welcome to IMPAKT 2021, and welcome to this talk entitled Cold Intimacies, Happycracy, and Emotions as Commodities, together with renowned sociologist Eva Illouz, who will be joining us online from Paris. Eva is professor of sociology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. She has been visiting professor at, among other places, Princeton and Northwestern universities. Her research explores the sociology of capitalism, emotions, gender, and culture, focusing on the influence of capitalism on emotions, the commodification of romance, and the meaning of freedom, choice, and individualism in the modern world. Eva's work has pinpointed how the role of emotions in modernity has been largely ignored in the discourse of the grand sociological narratives of modernity, and she has made this the focus of many of her investigations. Eva was also the first woman president of the Belazel Academy of Art and Design in Israel. She has written numerous books, including Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Love and the Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, which we'll be talking about today, Saving the Modern Soul, Therapy, Emotions, and the Culture of Self-Help, Why Love Hurts, A Sociological Explanation Polity, Emotions as Commodities, How Commodities Became Authentic, and Unloving, A Sociology of Negative Relations. Of all these books, I have to say that, for me at least, the book Cold Intimacies has been particularly influential in the making of this exhibition, Modern Love, and indeed the subtitle is borrowed from the title of Eva's book, Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, so I'm therefore quite indebted to her for her work. Several of her books have won international awards, including that of the American Sociological Association and the Annelies Meyer Award from the Humboldt Foundation in Germany. Her books have been translated into 23 languages. The German newspaper Die Zeit chose her as one of the thinkers most likely to change the thought of tomorrow. And I don't know about you, but she has certainly changed the way that I think about things. So I'd like to welcome Eva to this discussion. Hello, Eva.
Hello, Katerina.
Thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time off your busy schedule. I was asked to actually prepare a talk with structure. I was asked by Arjan to prepare a talk with structure, but in fact my talk doesn't have much structure because I actually prefer to have a conversation. So I'll start with a very, very simple question. How did you become interested in the concept of love as an academic pursuit? Because it's not the most fashionable subject in academic and intellectual circles, and indeed philosophical circles. And I know from my perspective that it's absolutely not fashionable at all in the world of contemporary art. So what brought you to this subject?
Well, before I respond to your question, I hear an echo. Do you hear an echo, by the way?
Can we have a tech check?
So let me just keep going while they're doing the check. I would argue with you that it's not a fashionable topic in philosophy, for example. I mean, Plato Symposium is one of the most, or maybe with the founding text of philosophy. And that text deals primarily with love. And so the question of love is really at the foundation of Western philosophy. Where in Plato, I mean, it enabled him to really articulate his idealist philosophies. I will not get into that text. With regard to sociology, I would also argue that probably the two most influential sociologists after World War II, which is Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, each one wrote a very significant book on love. And this was considered to be, in fact, one of the best ways to understand what modernity is about. So they studied love as a way to understand what individualism was about, what modern democracy was about, also where Giddens, for example, thought of intimacy as the new playground for new democratic forms. So this is just, just to take issue a little bit with you. I don't think that love is viewed as insignificant at all. I think, in fact, I could very easily argue that it's probably one of the most important topics to study if you want to understand something about contemporary society. It's extremely important, not only because it has been, for example, central to high culture through the novel, but also it has been central to the cultural industries such as the cinema and TV and women's magazines as well. It's extremely important because without love, you cannot understand the gender relationships and gender roles. It's extremely important because without it, you do not understand the big changes that marriage, as the central institution of any society, certainly still our society, you don't understand the huge, enormous changes that marriage has undergone. But also, and this has been the point of my work, you don't understand the ways in which contemporary economy works, which is by intensely sexualizing and emotionalizing, if you allow me to use these awful words, individuals. That is, it is by making us romantic and sexual subjects that we have come to be hyper consumers of leisure and of an array of products to enhance our image towards others. To go back to your question, which is how did I get to study this? I very much share the, Heideggerian point of view that an intellectual inquiry starts when something doesn't work, really. And so the reflection, the need to go back over something and to reflect on it is or emanates from a specific encounter with the world where you feel something broke down. And I think, already as an adolescent, I was completely unable to formulate what was wrong. I had not yet read Simone de Beauvoir. And I was actually an avid reader of women's magazines, as well as of Proust. And through these two, a combination of Proust and women's magazines, I kind of understood obscurely that love was a problem and that it occupied the central place in our lives on the one hand, but that it was something for which there were a lot of questions and no answers. so I guess my initial impulse derived from that sense of an enormous difficulty there that needed to be resolved and understood.
Thank you. I should actually have made my question more precise because I wasn't really talking about the history of philosophy. I'm Greek, so I grew up with Plato, but more to talk about actually recent developments. And in my experience researching this subject, at least from the culture discipline, I can tell you that I met with a lot of suspicion, and a lot of prejudice about love, which I consider is, of course, a cardinal emotion. And not only is it a cardinal emotion, but it's not a cliche to say that love makes the world go round. But the subject of this talk is actually more media rather than philosophy. So I'll go back to your book, Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Love and the Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, where you explored how the plethora of images that define our ideas of love and romance originate in and are, of course, embedded in consumer capitalism. And at the time you wrote the book, that was back in 1997, the internet was in its infancy, and there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram, and there was no Tinder. I want to ask you how you think things have changed in the perception of love and romance since then, especially with the advent of course, the internet and social media more than 20 years later. Because, of course, the commodification of love and the economic relations that underlie it, as you yourself know much better than I do, are something that goes back to, of course, the advent of capitalism and consumer society and advertising and all of that. But in the meantime, the internet has come along, the big corporations have come along, the body has been commodified, practically everything has been commodified. So what has been the effect of the internet and social media for you, especially in your consideration, in your long-standing consideration of these issues and of the issues of intimacy, love, intimate social relations?
Thank you very much. So, since you started your question by framing it, I think, very astutely through my first study, which was Consuming the Romantic Utopia, let me go back to that so that I can better highlight what I think is at stake today. So, this first study really tried to show, it was the first attempt to show how capitalism, consumer capitalism, really relied on romantic practices to get launched in a way. And that was a study of the ways in which leisure markets, the emergence of leisure markets, used and transformed romantic practices, and how we have this shift from courtship practices that happen at home to dating practices that happen in the outside leisure sphere. And so I documented this historical shift and then asked questions that sociologists are good at asking, which is, what is the meaning of the fact that heterosexual relationships became increasingly mediated by the market, by the leisure market? And there I refused, if you want, a kind of Marxian interpretation that commodities meant a corruption of emotions and interactions. And on the contrary, I was trying to show how commodities actually can really help frame and build much in a very efficient way ritual interactions between two people. So this is only to say that I started by trying to salvage consumer capitalism and by opposing a simple Marxian condemnation of the commodification of human relationships. That seemed to me a very simple-minded way of understanding the relationship between the world of objects and the world of human beings. And then, as you yourself said, In 2004, I was invited to give the Adorno lectures, and the third lecture was the third chapter of Cold Intimacies, which you mentioned before. And I believe I was the first to actually write on internet dating sites. In 2004, it was only a few years. Tinder was not yet around, but there were sites like Match.com and eHarmony. And I became very interested in the phenomenon of internet dating sites in the broader process that I called emotional capitalism. We can go back to this later if you want. Um, and there I saw a drastic change, in fact, in the relationship between commodities, emotions, and human relations. And when I revisited that study 10 years or, 15 years later by a study of Tinder, I saw that, to use the word of somebody, Christensen in Meli, I think was his name, who teaches in a business school, I saw that the Tinder operated a disruption of human relationships. A disruption is a central concept, often for business people who are trying to disrupt known patterns and in order to introduce an innovation and change the ways in which things are done. So I think that the ecology, what we may call really the ecology of heterosexual relationships, may have drastically changed through the combination of technology and capital. And this is something that I think is relatively new. I think we are witnessing some qualitative shift in the ways in which, for example, I mean, just to give you one example, the visuality. Visuality has always been an important feature of how you apprehend someone. But visuality has really become the main ways through which, for example, an app like Tinder builds a relationship between two people. And so visuality is becoming a main modality of initial interaction. And one of the questions I'm interested in is how that visuality, when it becomes on a quasi-exclusive way of interacting with others, how does it change the a priori way of apprehending others and oneself also? It changes completely conceptions of self. So yeah, that's I could elaborate, of course, but I would imagine you would prefer to move on to other questions.
Actually, this is a question that preoccupies me quite a lot because I am part of that generation, the in-between generation, like you, I believe, that remembers life before the internet. I'd like to make a small parenthesis, actually, before we go on to talk about the idea of emotional capitalism. And that is that I completely agree with you that there's a sea change, there's a fundamental shift going on, which we are not able to grasp at the moment. And to me, this has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with the technology, it has to do with the technological changes, it has to do with speed, with acceleration, and with evolution. And as we are social beings, and you know this better than I do, human beings are actually quite able to adapt. We are a very adaptable species. And over time, I mean, if you consider how long we've been on the planet, it's a nanosecond of the existence of the planet, we've had time to evolve and to adapt to our environment. Now, what concerns me is that since the advent, of course, of industrial modernity and after that, it seems that everything has been exponentially accelerating. It's like as if we've put our foot on the pedal and we're just like, just pressing on the gas to get more speed. And I'm wondering, are we equipped to deal with the speed of the change that we are actually inflicting upon ourselves. Are things perhaps a bit too fast for us? I mean, the internet itself and social media have come into our lives in a very short time span. They have become normalized. We now can't even think of leaving the house without our mobile phones. And yet, at the same time, we're under an enormous amount of pressure: information pressure, interaction pressure, performance pressure. Are we equipped to deal with all of this?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. The question of equipped refers to brain structure and to cognition, and I don't feel I'm able to respond a question like that. I think, again, for me, what is important in the question you ask is whether a technology or a rhythm of innovation is deeply disruptive of sociality as we knew it, and of sociality as we can do it, not only as we knew it, but as we can do it. Now, what the internet and social media are heralding is simply a new way of forming relationships. You don't have to have face-to-face interactions. You don't have to have shared memories. You don't have to share, national consciousness with them, for example. I mean, just think of the ways in which nationalism completely changed the awareness and the consciousness of people in the 19th century. Through the newspaper, people read the same newspaper, and with the nascent nationalist ideologies came to believe they belonged to a single community. Now, that really shows that technology can really shape the ways in which people imagine themselves, and imagine the group to which they belong. I think, for example, that the internet is breaking down those kind of ways of building national communities. So people will much more easily identify with the tiny communities transnational tiny communities that they may create through social media, and they will create a community through an opinion or through the common hatred of something. Actually, common hatred has become, I think, a profound way of building new solidarities. So, so whether we are equipped or not, I would not know to say. I would know to say that it is disruptive of the ways in which national communities and political communities have been built so far. Yes. So it does not matter in a way for me whether we are equipped for this or not. The question is whether these changes are for the good or not. I think right now we seem to think that they are not. We seem to think that, I mean, I think the first 20 years of the internet were years of exhilaration and a sense that this was a medium that would finally transcend boundaries of nations and class, and that people could have access to this vast wealth of knowledge. And I think we are now living in a period of profound disenchantment with the internet, in which we understand, for example, that the anonymity that is afforded by the internet is a new way of sociality. Anonymity, when you think of it, was really never an option in most communities and human societies. And anonymity enables the breakdown of norms. It enables really people to let go of what Norbert Elias or Sigmund Freud thought was the most distinct characteristic of civilized behavior, which is self-restraint and obedience or to certain norms of behavior. So anonymity would be one ways in which sociality as we knew it is disrupted. Take another example, which is also the enormous amount of choice um, that, for example, internet dating sites um, offer. And here I feel more able to answer your questions. S- uh,
That
to-
actually. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, just to go back, because you've mentioned a lot of really interesting things, including common hatred, of course, which I'd also like to come back to. But what you said about the internet and the perception of the internet as something that is largely negative. Indeed, the internet 20 years ago signaled this brave new world, as we remember. I like to kind of liken it to a very small degree to television. Television could have been an incredible boon to mankind. Unfortunately, it fell into the hands of the wrong people. And that's what happens when money and power are at play. And this is what we can see now with everything that is happening with Facebook and the whistleblowers and all of that. But I want to go back to this idea of before I go back to the idea of emotional capitalism, I think it's important to say that the internet is not good or bad per se. The internet is neutral. It is how it is deployed, who uses it, and to what ends, to what means it's used that actually proffers it an ethical parameter. But let's go back to this idea of emotional capitalism. The main premise of your book is, of course, that the culture of capitalism has nurtured a very powerful emotional culture, while economic relations have become emotional and intimate relationships have become more and more defined by economics. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more on this idea of emotional capitalism for our audience here who maybe has not read your book.
So, one of the ways in which Marx or Weber conceived of capitalism, and not only them, but also Adorno and Horkheimer and many people, is as the deployment of instrumental rationality. That's mostly the ways in which this new economic system is thought about, at least by sociologists. And rationality is viewed also as antithetical with emotions. There is an old tradition, not only in sociology, but in philosophy as well, to build a contrast between the two. And what I try to show is that, in fact, the making of capitalism, that you have two parallel paths, which is an increase of rationality as well as a foregrounding of emotionality of emotions through the rise of therapeutic psychological culture. So Freud was probably more influential in the end than Marx. I think, if we look at the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, we can say perhaps in hindsight, that from a cultural standpoint, Freud was more influential in the sense that he transformed more dramatically the sense of self that modern people have. And the Freudian legacy translated in, actually, I'm skipping over a lot of stages, but in psychologists playing an enormous part, not only in advertising and marketing, in trying to understand and figure out how to sell goods and commodities, but also, for example, in corporations, helping managers figure out how to create a more productive workforce, and teaching managers and workers to have less conflictual, more peaceful relationships, that is, relationships which managers and owners of big corporations could better, in fact, control. And increasingly, the the key to a to an efficient life, to an efficient relationship, to a good marriage, to a good manager and worker relationship. In very many areas of social life, psychologists increasingly preached the idea of emotion management in not only in the corporation, but also in social work, in order to manage social problems, in marriage, in sexuality, in education. And so I was interested in the ways in which you have this culture that makes emotions really the centerpiece of culture. And in doing so, also commodifies emotions. In fact, when you attend a workshop to control your stress or your anger, you are actually purchasing, in a way, an emotional commodity. So this is what I was interested in. I was interested in this dual relationship of the emotionalization of economic relationships, for example, in corporations, and the ways in which emotions become commodified and integrated in the market, as well as the ways in which, for example, psychology transforms us into increasingly more rational human beings. In fact, one of the main, I think, cultural effects of psychology is to make us better able to control our affects and make our affects correspond to a predefined value or goal, which is, in fact, the definition of rationality. When you're able to act according to a preset goal or value, then you're acting more rationally. And that has been, on the whole, the effect of psychology. So, what interested me, emotional capitalism, is the interaction, if you want, between the cultural values of psychology and psychologists and many economic uh, um, sites, such as corporations, which use emotions. So it's this reciprocal process of putting emotions at the center, at the forefront of economic relations, and vice versa, making emotional relationships much more rational. I hope I was clear.
Absolutely clear, and I want to diverge a little bit and move away perhaps from the culture of the workplace and the market, and more to the sphere of the private. What you're talking about, of course, involves engineering, social engineering. It also, of course, involves instrumentalization of human beings. And indeed, we've come to think of like relationships, particularly couple relationships, quantified in economic terms nowadays more and more. What can this person offer me? What service can he or she or they provide me? What can I take? Am I taking? Am I taking as much as I give? There's always some kind of sort of balancing act going on. And I want to ask you, when relationships are actually quantified in these terms, and this might sound rather naive to you, but it's actually a human question more than a sociological question. What happens to the authenticity of emotions when emotions are actually co-opted in such way? And in fact, all of this, what you discussed, is actually part of capitalism, it's part of the marketplace, and it's part of the workplace and productivity and rationality and all of the things that you very, very correctly described. But what about the actual authenticity of emotion, and what about the gap that exists between how we exist in the workplace and then when we go back home to our social lives, to our loved ones, because we're programmed to think in a particular way?
Thank you for your question. I would have trouble answering it because I think it really depends on the definition of the person you have. I happen to think that there is no degree zero of authenticity. So I want to share with you my dilemma. That's what I wanted to say. On the one
Define what
hand, I don't.
authenticity is. I mean, authenticity is to
Yes.
each person, you're absolutely right. It's a completely subjective
No, no,
idea.
no, no, no. That's not what I meant to say. No, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is, on the one hand, I don't think that if the guilt that the believer feels when he goes or she goes to the church is authentic, more authentic than the fun I may feel when I go to a discotheque. Both are institutionally engineered. Both feelings, I mean, the guilt and the fun depend on an institution, they depend on a frame, on a space, on a story. So, in that sense, I would not want to say the feelings we feel in a commercialized society are fake, the feelings we feel in a church are authentic. So, that's claim number one. Claim number one says whatever we feel is always produced by a context, by a place, by a story, by an institution. But on the other hand, the second term of the hesitation is that we know, and especially I think women know, that there are lives that are lived in a way that is false. You know, when Betty Friedan wrote um, in 1963, The Feminine Mystique, I think, and when she talked about the kind of role that women were forced to play, being good housewives, being good mothers, not claiming anything for themselves, waiting for their husband, having a smile painted on their face. And at some point, there is something in the consciousness that cracks up. There is a crack in consciousness. And Betty Friedan wrote the book of her generation in saying we can no longer live this false life. And we want to claim something more authentic, because this is what she was doing, because feminism was a way of claiming a more authentic lives for women, and not only a life that had been prescripted and pre-written for them. So I believe that there is a very strong moral meaning and political meaning also to authenticity. That's, I think, also the meaning of many 19th century and 20th century heroines' act of revolt against their social milieu. And Ibsen, for example, people revolt against something in their environment. So what I want to say is that the issue of authenticity is a very complex one, in my opinion, and you really need, in a way, to take sides, whether you believe that individuals exist prior to or outside of institutional arrangements, and or whether they are actually always the product, and what they feel is always the product of the context in which they live. So I think for me, the issue of authenticity arises when the individual simply starts feeling uncomfortable, when the individual starts playing a role, when the individual starts feeling that his smile or her smile is painted. That's when the issue of authenticity raises.
That's a very, very good comment. I want to go back because I see time is running, and we also need to take some questions from the audience. You mentioned choice, I believe, a little bit earlier. And one of the things that you've said is that the transformation of love in modernity is through the category of choice. And you said, and I'll quote you, we have all these choices and we think that it's a type of freedom, but it's not. A complex menu of options is not necessarily freedom. Can you speak a little bit more about these ideas of choice and freedom, especially when it comes to love today? Because indeed, for example, internet dating sort of transforms people into shoppers. I always find it rather disturbing, that people are swiped on Tinder, for example. But then what is freedom when it comes to love today, especially under the status quo of the internet and technology and indeed interpersonal relationships?
Thank you so much. And you enable me also to maybe just complete my answer to your question earlier with regard to whether we are equipped or not to deal with the technological changes around us. So I think choice and freedom are not the same, but we tend to confuse the two. Freedom is a philosophical and political ideal. And choice, in my opinion, was the capitalist conversion of this lofty ideal. And I think a great deal of modern individualism or modern societies, how modern societies speak to modern individuals and legitimize themselves is through this ideology of choice, by giving the choice. I mean, think of it as, voting is an act of choice. So that's how we define politics. And consumerism or consumer purchase is viewed as choice. And I think there is a big difference between the two because, among other reasons, if you look at the ways in which choice has been enacted on internet dating sites, since this has been a red thread throughout our conversation, I think choice changes, too much choice actually changes our preferences, to speak like economists. It changes the very capacity to will and desire. It changes the very structure of desire. And this, I feel, is a very interesting development because we do know from a lot of experiments in cognitive psychology that we are not equipped, to go back to your question, Katerina, we are not well equipped to make the right choice when there is a too great abundance of choice. And I will not get into the detail. And what happens actually is that desire itself and the very language of passion has changed. And this is one of the reasons why also I think there has been a tremendous cooling of passion and desires. It is, among other things, because of the ways in which choice is arrayed and actually blunts the very capacity to desire and the very relationship between desire and scarcity. There has always been a relationship between desire and scarcity, and it is this relationship that is being disrupted and disturbed.
This brings me perfectly to the next question, actually, because it's related to the idea of desire, and it is, of course, that of the romantic imagination, which is also something that you've written about and talked about, and the idea, of course, that the internet, well, not the idea, the reality, that the internet has changed the romantic imagination, and indeed it has. And you've said that the shift has been from retrospective to anticipatory. Can you perhaps talk a little bit more about this shift? Because I think it does have to do a little bit with the ideas about desire that you just outlined.
One of the things that really interested me was the relationship that we have come to develop to an object that we have not yet met and that we are going to meet. And in a way, I mean, this is how the internet is structured. You speak to somebody on the phone and then you meet them. But in a way, I take this temporal structure as being, or as reflecting, if you want, the entire ways in which the self is dislocated from itself. So anticipation and the attempt to live something that awaits for you, that you are expecting, something that you have already an image of, but that and which you will then meet, in a way has become again the main ways in which we encounter the world, whether it is whether you're looking for an apartment and you looked at the pictures on the internet, whether you're meeting a prospective partner, whether you're meeting or encountering a hotel room and a touristic site which you have already visited on the internet, all of this is changing the ways in which we encounter the world, so that the world becomes a kind of constant comparison between the image in the literal sense, not in the cognitive sense, the real image we had, and the actual person or place or site that we are encountering. Again, that seems to me a new cognitive challenge, a cognitive and emotional challenge. I think disappointment and the management of expectations has become absolutely crucial to what it means to be a modern person, much more so than in previous periods.
I'm told that we are ready to take questions from the audience, even though I had lots more questions. Maybe we can continue a little bit later. First, I have to check this iPad. I lost Eva on the screen, but let's see.
You don't see me?
Now I see you.
Okay.
Are there any questions from the audience?
So the questions are through the chat?
I'm not seeing something on my iPad, but we can, in fact, yes, we have a rather strange contraption here, which, so if anybody just wants to ask Eva a question, please raise their hand, and you have to play a bit of basketball. Hands, and I can't see very well, so any hands in the audience? Oh yes, I can see one up there. So we've got a microphone that is sort of like flying around like a ball. It's not a kind of microphone as you're used to. Yes.
Thanks. You said, Eva, that you see too much choice as a problem, but then the question is, who or how would you like to limit the choices people currently have?
I don't. I have again the echo. I don't want to police things. I am more comfortable pointing at problems rather than policing them. I will just give you an example. Internet dating sites are themselves aware of the problem. And so it seems that one of the new profitable directions these sites are going into is by limiting the number of people you can interact with. So that's a very practical answer. I think a practical and not very interesting answer to your question, which is that, for example, some sites now allow you to interact only with one person a day. And as far as I know, these sites seem to be quite successful. So this is taking into account the kind of capabilities, the kind of cognitive and emotional capabilities that we have. But also, my purpose was simply to raise a question about our sometimes uncritical view that more is better and more choice is better. I think this is how we have in fact justified endless production precisely through this ideology of choice. But also, more to the point, more choice, especially when it comes to persons, has the effect of kind of creating conditions of lessening the value of people. And I just will give you an example of an experiment that two psychologists at the University of Chicago did. They defined two ways of evaluating. One they call the joint evaluation mode, and one they call the single evaluation mode. The joint evaluation mode is you go into a supermarket and you see 10 types of vases, and you have to hesitate and decide which vase you want to buy. And then you have the single evaluation mode, which is the mode of the auction house. You go into an auction house and you have a single object. So they do an experiment where, they put a vase in among 10 other types of vase. And then they put the single evaluation, they put this vase, they put it alone. And they're going to ask people how much they're willing to pay for them. And it turns out that in the single evaluation mode, that is the auction house mode, people are willing to pay much, much more money, which means very counterintuitively, maybe, that in fact, when you are able to compare something to other things, its value diminishes tremendously. And I think it's okay when this happens to vases. I think it's less okay when this happens to people.
Any more questions from? I've got the light coming in my eye. Is there another question?
Yes, here.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Hi. I'm just listening to what you've been talking about here, and
Can you speak up a bit? Sorry.
unfortunately, I am not familiar with the work, with the books. So maybe this is an obvious question, and maybe this has been already stated somewhere. But I'm just curious if the author can say something about the trajectory we are following and where we are actually going, considering how current status quo is, where we will end up eventually. How will relationships look like? Is there some sort of forecast that you can think of for the future?
Thank you for a question I'm usually bad at responding to, which is forecast. I don't think with regard to relationships there is there will be a single trend. I mean, if anything, the direction is of extraordinary plurality of forms of life that go along with the extraordinary plurality of forms of sexuality. So I think probably, traditional marriage will survive, and actually marriage has been saved by homosexuals since they fought for it for the last 20 years and made, funnily, they made marriage into something, something radical and desirable again. So marriage will continue to exist, I think, but I think that we can already observe a withdrawal from intimacy. I think for me, that's probably one of the most interesting trend. 2 or 3 years ago, The Atlantic had done a big survey on the sexual practices of young people and had found that young Americans were having much less sex than the baby boomers. And the reason why people are having less sex is not because they became more puritanical or are having less casual sex, is because most sex happens in committed regular relationships. and these happen less. So one of the big transformations I think that is happening is the rise of what I call in my book the end of love, the rise of negative relationships. That is, relationships that get undone as soon as they are done. It's this movement of doing and undoing that seems to me very interesting in the realm of romantic relationships. And the overall impact, I think, is a much greater difficulty of forming stable, intimate bonds. And so once that happens, so then there is a variety, I think, of options to it. I think, for example, homosexuality is probably one response. It's not only, of course, homosexuality is a complex phenomenon, but a part of current homosexuality is also a response to what we can view as the breakdown of heterosexual relationships. Um, um, so for me, that is probably the most interesting trend. It does not cover, of course, the entirety of what will happen, but what is happening distinctly is a greater difficulty to hold on to stable, committed relationships, what I call negative relations.
Thank you, Eva. And I think this is just as much time that we have for. Just a very short postscriptum. Do you think, well, actually, Emotional Capitalism, Cold Intimacies, was a very prophetic book. Because, of course, now we've all come to experience the cold intimacies of the pandemic. And to close this discussion, I'd like to ask you if you think that this withdrawal from intimacy, which is on the one hand a kind of sociological phenomenon as you describe it, but also is a kind of enforced condition due to the pandemic. Do you think that this withdrawal from intimacy is going to be something that will be and has been exacerbated by, of course, the pandemic, COVID-19? And this will be my last question.
I think what we experienced during the pandemic is two things. One is a kind of implosion of the family unto itself. So the family becoming way too hot, with parents and children and men and women being all the time together, as opposed to having these different trajectories during the day, and this distance, which really enables family life. That's what we realized, is that we need some coldness in the form of distancing it for families to remain sane, unless we live in mansions and gorgeous houses, but most of us don't have that fortune. So we have that implosion of families onto themselves on the one hand, and we had indeed a kind of loneliness that was compensated for by the technology. So I think this is a point where the technology started assuming a completely human face. And whereas in normal times, I think we would be willing to criticize technology, I think many of us, especially those of us who were alone on their own, and a lot of people were alone at home, viewed technology as the savior. And in fact, I would say probably we had as much as I think the question this raises for me is whether the drastic measures that were taken and that have no precedent in the history of pandemics. I mean, we had pandemics before, and never before were we so divided and forbidden to interact with with others. I wonder if it was not made possible by, in fact, the technology. It is because we knew we could interact with others through our screens, that maybe these the distancing was possible in such drastic terms. It's just a question I'm raising. I don't know.
Thank you very, very much, Eva, for being with us. Thank you for this interesting discussion. Thank you for your time. Thank you also to the audience. And I'd like to mention that for those of you who are with us, at 9:30 you'll be able to see the screening of Melanie Bonayo's film, Night Soil, Economy of Love, in Studio 3. So that's it from me, and that's it from Eva. Thank you very much, Eva. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.